when it tells me. There we go, gang. We're now recording. I'm just going to read out a brief statement and then I'll hand back over to Wolfgang to introduce our guest in the session. So here we go. Today's webinar is being recorded. Please could everybody ensure that their video is switched off and that you only use first names when addressing others in order to ensure that there is no identification of individuals after the session. We record webinars for a number of reasons. Firstly, for internal training purposes. Secondly, to provide to our funders as part of our commitment to them. And thirdly, so that trainees like yourselves can watch these sessions back in the future in order to support their career development where they've been unable to attend the live session themselves. We store these videos on our secure internal Teams platform and as private YouTube videos, which cannot be accessed without our permission. We will store these videos for a maximum of 5 years. You have the right to choose to leave the session at any stage if you do not wish to be recorded. If you do choose to leave, we will attempt to hold another unrecorded webinar to accommodate you. If you have spoken during the session and wish the recordings to be deleted, we will do so. Neither Microsoft Teams nor Springboard store any information about you, including your IP address, and for any further information or for a transcript of what I've just said, please visit the news article Understanding Webinars on your Flow platform for a full readout.
Wow, well done, Ted. Wow, that's amazing. You're definitely doing this much quicker than I could ever do that. Okay, well, welcome, guys. First of all, I'd like to introduce you to Lucy Stevenson from WSET. First of all, Lucy, thank you so much for being here today on this Friday afternoon and telling us a little bit more about, first of all, you maybe, and then a little bit of what you do. So first of all, tell us about your company, WSET, that you work for, and what is your job like? What are you doing on a day-to-day basis?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. So yeah, I work for the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, which is WSET. I have a kind of dual role there where I'm a marketing manager for the flagship school, which is their largest school, which is based in London Bridge. And I also teach at that school as well. So I have a kind of combination educator marketing role there. So if you're not familiar with the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, it's the world's leading provider of qualifications in wines, spirits and sake as well. So yeah, what I teach is wines. That's kind of my speciality, but we have specialist spirits educators, specialist sake educators, and hopefully within the next year or so, we'll be adding beer to our repertoire of courses as well. Wow. So yeah, we do qualification. Yeah, me too. I'm really excited for that. So yeah, we start from complete beginner level, and at the school we do tastings that aren't qualifications as well, so just complete beginner stuff, all the way through to a 2-year diploma qualification in wines if you wanted to get like really detailed, and kind of everywhere in between that.
Fantastic. So tell us a little bit about how does somebody get to work for WSET, or what sort of background you need to have? You need to be kind of born into a wine family or into a wine chateau, or what's your background a little bit, Lucy?
I mean, there's all sorts of different backgrounds at WSET, and like any kind of company, it's a global company. There are roles where you do need to have large amounts of wine knowledge. That doesn't mean you need to be born into wine by any means. I certainly wasn't. There was not a lot of interest in wine in my family. It was kind of an accidental route for myself. Some people, of course, kind of, maybe their parents were a winemaker or something like that. A lot of people came in through working in shops. But for myself, I worked in hospitality, and that was my background originally. During my studies, so during the end of school and when I was at university as well, I was working in hospitality throughout that. And to be honest, it became more interesting to me, the hospitality side, than my actual degree was. Okay. So once I left university, I decided to have a go at working in hospitality full time. And actually part of my kind of route into that was I'd found out about the WSET qualifications. So I thought, okay, that would be quite helpful for me. So I saved up a bit of my money from working in the pub and a bit of birthday money, and did my WSET level 2 qualification. And then completely by chance, I found out that there was a role available at WSET, and it was a purely administrative role. So totally quite different from hospitality. And I just kind of went in that way once I was finished at uni, and I was processing exam papers essentially for the first part. Okay. But just with the best bunch of people, like so much fun, and most of that team didn't have any wine background, any wine knowledge, but they're really great at training as a company, so they kind of put everyone who was interested in learning more about the qualifications through them, and through that I kind of then sort of moved around the company a bit, moved into a sort of sales and marketing role, and then an events-based role. Then I left the company and went to work for an imported distributor for a couple of years, just to kind of broaden the horizons, I guess, learn a little bit more about the industry in general. And then I just sort of gravitated back towards it because I was teaching by that point as well. And I then ended up back in a kind of combination marketing and education role. But that's just one of the many routes that people have found themselves coming into the company.
Okay. So this is obviously a hospitality-based employability program. All of the guys that are listening here today, they are very much interested in careers in the industry. Tell us a bit more in detail about your hospitality career, if you don't mind, before you went to WSET.
Sure, yeah. So it was, I mean, where I grew up in Yorkshire, I kind of started out in cafes. So I was kind of working in cafes from the age of sort of about 15. And then when I became old enough to, I moved into a wine bar called Pitcher and Piano. So kind of like a chain wine bar that you find all around the country, which was very lively, the sort of drinks before the big night out in town. So it could be, it's quite good fun, quite rowdy bunch of people. And then when I went to university, I worked in the student union pub called the Dirty Duck at my student union, and basically worked there throughout university. I did do a short amount of time after uni at Hotel de Vin in where I grew up in Yorkshire as well. But to be honest, one of the major drawbacks for me about my potential hospitality career was that I have quite a bad tremor in my arm. So I'm not particularly good as a sommelier, and that's never been my strong point. So I was always a little bit shaky on the floor. Which was always a bit scary when you're working with new wines that you know, especially. But
okay, so tell us a bit more about your current role then. So what is your sort of day-to-day business look like? What does your typical day look like?
I mean, yeah, typical days have kind of gone out the window recently, but
yes, fair enough.
In the normal world, we have a school in London Bridge, and we've got there now sort of 6 classrooms, and at any one time, pretty much all of those classrooms are full, and we're running courses from level 1, which is our beginner level 1-day course, through to the diploma qualification, which takes the better part of 2 years to complete. And so there's all levels of knowledge and all those different subject streams kind of being studied at the same time. So if you walk around our flagship school, you'll see people of all backgrounds, all levels of knowledge. But you know, they might just be walking into a wine class for the first time ever that day, or they might be halfway through their diploma and everywhere. You know, sort of all the spaces in between that. In terms of my role, I'm essentially in charge of promoting the courses. So I both in terms of business to business, kind of encouraging companies within hospitality and within the broader drinks industry to train their staff and to convince them of the value of training, which is obviously something I'm very passionate about. But also individuals who are self-funding, whether that be because they want to move into the industry or just purely because they quite like wine and they want to know a little bit more about it. So we have an increasing number of people on the courses who are just doing it for the interest, for the fun of learning.
And what kind of qualification in terms of wine does WSET offer? Did you say there's 3 levels, or is there more than that?
For the wine qualifications, we have 4. So there's 3 for spirits and 2 for sake. We have a level 1 and a level 3 in sake. At the moment, we don't have a level 2, but for the others, we have level 1, 2, 3, and then for the wine side of things, we have the diploma qualification, which is a level 4. So they're off-qual regulated qualifications, so they are sort of recognised by the UK government and globally recognised as well.
And so who are typically the people that are doing sort of the various different levels? So is it more sort of private people doing the level 1 and then professional like sommeliers? Do they do all 4 levels? Where does that fit in?
I think one of the fun things about our courses is that if you might come in thinking you're probably just going to do one, but quite often people tend to get the bug, and if they can continue to go through, if it's something that their company, for example, is going to sponsor them through or support them through, or if they're able to self-fund, people tend to kind of go as far as they have the time for. So we have a lot of what we might call enthusiasts on our level 1 and 2 courses, but in the same class you'll also have people who are quite, who are in hospitality, who have maybe just recently started working in a wine shop, or actually because there's a kind of a really kind of vibrant English wine scene now at the moment, and we're not too far away from those English vineyards. We have quite a lot of people who are maybe working in a vineyard or working in a winery for the first time and just want to broaden their knowledge of the world of wine.
And obviously before COVID, you did most of the training, or all of your training face-to-face, I take it. And how has it changed? What have you been able to do during lockdown?
So yeah, luckily we've always had well, not always, but for quite a long time now, we've had an online option for our courses.
Okay.
So it has been possible to study the courses online for as long as I've been part of the company, and I think quite a while before that as well. But we definitely have stepped that up a lot in the last few months. There was lots of things, like with many companies, there was lots of things on the cards, improvements we were going to make to the online learning. And I think one of the big drawbacks was that you didn't used to be able to have your exam online. You had to come into the classroom for that. And now we've made the exams available online for both our level 1 and our level 2 qualifications. So now you can study the level 1 and 2 100% online from wherever you are in the world, essentially. So it kind of opens it up to loads of people who might not be near a classroom, might not be near an exam centre.
So it's not a big part of the exams also some tasting? I always understand that to learn about wine, it's obviously one thing is reading about it. The other thing is obviously tasting it. So how does that work in the sort of online environment then?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And tasting is it's an important part of every single one of our qualifications, from level 1 through to the diploma. And there is no WSET without the tasting side of it. So that's something that we teach from right at the beginning. So yeah, that is obviously one of the bigger challenges with online learning. There are lots of different options available for people who are wanting to learn online. The simplest one, if you happen to be fortunate enough to be local to a wine shop or even a supermarket with a broad variety of different styles, then we will give you the support that you need to go and source the wines yourself. And actually, that can be quite a fun part of doing the courses online. You can kind of like go and do a bit of shopping around in the supermarkets, etc. But obviously that can rack up a little bit in cost depending on the level that you're going to. So level 1, there's not that many wines that you need to try, but obviously at level 2 it gets bigger, and level 3. So there are some companies that exist that we work in partnership with that allow you to buy a sample pack. So you buy basically lots of small bottles which contain a tasting sample of all the wines that you'd be expected to try on the course. So we kind of have a few different ways of getting around that.
Oh, that sounds exciting. And just give us a bit of an idea of how much would like a WSET level 1 cost for somebody to be enrolling into that?
So if you take it online through the school, which is our flagship centre, and it does depend. It depends on where you're studying, because each school has its own prices that they have to put into the final cost. But as a benchmark, the flagship school that I work for, the online version of the level 1 is £135.
Okay.
And the classroom version, which includes the wines, and obviously that involves the kind of classroom environment, is £185.
Great. So level 4 must be quite complex. Then there must be a lot of knowledge, a lot of studying to be done there. Typically, is it just sommeliers who pass that kind of level, or are there quite a few people out there who have passed that level?
Yeah, so we hit. I think last year we hit about 10,000, just over 10,000 people now who've passed it. Who've passed it globally, and yeah, it used to be the case that it was kind of people who were very, very, kind of moving into more senior level positions, whether that be in sommelier, or that be in, maybe import distribution of wines or the sale of wines, whatever it might be. But yeah, again, it's just diversifying hugely the people who are coming on the courses. I did my diploma as an evening class. Finished it in about 2015, I think, and on that course there was about, I would say, 2/3 were people in the industry, and about 1/3 were people who'd just done level 1 and 2 and 3 and just decided to keep going because they loved it. And especially as an evening course, it's quite a nice hobby, I guess, if you can.
It sure is, yeah. So in those classes that you would have tasting happening as well at the same time, I would imagine.
Yeah, lots of tasting.
Great. That sounds like an interesting one. Okay, well, one last thing maybe before we hand over to you to your presentation. Obviously, you know that all of our candidates here are job seekers there, and you've got some experience working in this industry. What sort of top tips would you have for these guys in terms of finding the next job there? What sort of tips would you have up your sleeve?
I mean, yeah, in terms of kind of building CVs and stuff, WSET qualifications are incredibly valuable, but there's also a huge amount of beginner level free content that's available out there if you're not quite ready or not quite able to take a WSET qualification straight away. So if you want to start kind of showing an interest, if you're really able to show an interest in the product and interest in the wine, just being curious about it and being able to show that curiosity by looking into different parts of the internet essentially for some free content. If you go on WSET Global's website, if you go on our YouTube channel, there's hours and hours of free educational content. So we're going to do a little bit of a demonstration today, but if you want to learn more about specific grape varieties or specific regions, there's loads and loads of content on there too. So I think one of the biggest things is being able to demonstrate an interest, particularly in how food and wine interact, because it's such a big, I think most chefs and most people who are passionate about food and wine see wine as just another ingredient to the meal. So if you can work out how the food and the wine interact, and just take as much, as many opportunities as you can to play with food and wine, and kind of build up that bank of interest and that bank of knowledge, that would be a really useful place to start from the wine side of things.
And lastly, I'm pretty sure there will be some people on the webinar today who are maybe just saying, you know what, I really don't like wine. What would you do to convince them to at least try something different, or just to sort of open up the door and just try something new, basically? What would you say to them?
I mean, lots of people say that, or maybe particularly about certain wine styles. The thing is, like for me, I guess for me, it's almost like saying I don't like food, because there's just so many so many different types of it. And you may just not be someone who drinks wine for whatever reason that might be. But if you are someone who is happy to taste wines and enjoy them, I just think it's if it helps. When I first decided I wanted to have a look into the wine world, I didn't like red wine at all, or I thought I didn't like red wine, because I've had a few red wines that I was just really like, that's not for me. It's too this or it's too that. And I guess I just made myself, I was just like, I'm just going to try a few more wines and just try and push through this. And yeah, it just takes that first one or two. You're actually like, this is pretty good. I thought this is better than I was expecting this style of wine to be. It's just keeping an open mind, I think, as much as possible, and knowing that there is every possible style of wine out there, from completely dry and very acidic through to really, really sweet, there's sparkling, there's fortified. I've yet to find someone who drinks wine and is happy to drink wine who hasn't found at least one that they are surprised by how much they like it.
Great. I actually have one more question that interests me personally. So now you might buy your wine through specialist wine shops, but is there any sort of mainstream supermarket that you could recommend to buy your everyday wine in for sort of everyday drinking? Is there a supermarket that you would recommend over others, maybe?
This is a tricky one for me, because WSET was brand agnostic, so we don't necessarily recommend particular supermarkets. In fact, to be honest, in the UK, we're just incredibly fortunate, because all of our supermarkets have incredibly smart, very knowledgeable people at the helm of their wine buying teams. Okay. And if you go into any of those supermarkets, there's going to be a broad variety. But one thing I would just suggest is having a go at shopping online, because that's where quite a lot of the fun wines and the hidden gem wines are found. Mm-hmm. And you can see people's reviews of them as well, so you can kind of get a bit more of a sense. So Waitrose, Marks and Spencers, all those kind of ones, they have some good detail about the wines on there too. So if you want to learn a little bit about them, because it can be quite hard when you're just in a supermarket and you're faced with this massive shelf of wines to kind of know which one to go for. So I find being able to take that time to search online is quite a good place to start. And
great. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for sharing some of your personal experiences there, Lucy. Over to you. Let's hear a little bit more about wine in general, and see whether you can maybe inspire some of these guys out there who've maybe consider themselves as non-wine drinkers, or not really interested in wine, or not liking wine. Maybe we can encourage one or two of them to maybe give it another try. Over to you.
Can I ask a question from the chat, Wolfgang?
Absolutely.
Come on then. Yeah, of course. Sorry. Yes, go for it.
So I've answered one of them about the websites where online courses are at. I've put the WSET Global website in there.
Thank you.
Beth is asking, do you have to do the qualifications in sequence, or can you jump straight to level 3 or 4?
Really good question. So at the school, and different centres have different rules about this. You can definitely start. You don't have to do them in sequence. You don't have to do level 1 before you do level 2. If you want to go straight to level 3, you can in theory do that, but we ask you to pass an online assessment, because basically when we get to level 3, we have to assume that people know the stuff that you would learn at level 2. We don't have time in the classroom to teach the level 2 stuff again. So we basically just need you to kind of prove that you have that knowledge. So there's an online entry test, and the fee of that is reimbursed against the cost of the course should you pass it.
Brilliant. Then I've got 2 questions from Athman. This one's maybe opinion based, maybe factual, who knows. This one's what is the best wine in the world and how much does it cost?
Again, I have to play my brand agnostic card. I can just tell you what my favorite wines are. Not necessarily a specific one, but so I just have weird tastes. I started really just liking very light, crisp wines, as I said, no red wines, and then my tastes have changed absolutely, completely to the other end of the spectrum. And now my favorite wine in the world is actually sherry, which is a fortified wine, or a range of fortified wines. And I really, really like some of these, like there's a wine called a Fino sherry, which is quite a specific style of wine that a lot of people, the first time I tasted it, I thought was the weirdest thing I'd ever tasted. And then it became a bit like, when some people have trained themselves to like olives. And it becomes really moorish and really like savoury, more a savoury tooth than a sweet tooth. So that's probably my favourite. And the wonderful thing about Fino sherry is it doesn't cost very much at all, because it's a really underrated wine. So yeah, that's what I think in terms of the best wines in the world. Some people would be saying the top quality Bordeaux, I'm sure, and you'd be paying many thousands of pounds per bottle for those. But I've a relatively inexpensive taste, I suppose, in that sense.
Brilliant. I've got a couple more. Wow. What makes a good wine for you? How do you define a good wine? I know I've certainly given my answer to the students already, and someone will put it in the chat. But
good question.
It's a really good question, a really hard one to answer quickly. I mean, on our courses, we have to try and make some objective conclusions about whether one wine is better than the other. At the end of the day, it depends what you're making the decision for. If it's just like, will I buy it again? It only comes down to, do you like it? But if you're trying to make decisions for other people, and they might have different tastes than you, there's lots of different things. There's like, is it interesting? Does it give you lots of different flavors, or does it just give you one flavor? Does it last for a long time in your mouth once you've sipped the wine and swallowed it? Does the flavor disappear straight away, or does it last for a really long time? If it lasts for a long time, that tends to be a higher quality wine with a bit more concentration. And is it really hard to get the aromas, or do they kind of leap out of the glass at you? All those kinds of factors are gonna help you to decide whether one wine is better than another. It's so subjective. It's really hard to kind of look beyond your tastes, but if you can look to these kind of quality indicators, I suppose that's how we tend to judge things at the school. So we have a few different benchmarks, I suppose.
I really like that. I think that was the professional wine answer, whereas I usually just say, if you like it, you like it. If you don't, you don't.
Well, to be honest, that's still how I buy my wine. So,
me too. And I've got one more. For the online courses, if you might struggle to pay up front for the course, is there any way that there is help for funding to pay for the course? Is there anything like that?
There is. WSET runs a bursary scheme. If I can drop some details to you guys to be able to forward on about the bursary scheme that WSET runs as well. And different centres around the country also maybe have payment plans there too. We have a payment plan for our diploma qualification, because that is quite a chunky investment. So by all means, get in touch, and we can always see what we can do.
That would be brilliant, gang. We'll try and throw that up as a news article on Flow, but I've just put a link in there for the WSET bursary scheme onto the chat team. And I'm out of questions. I'll be quiet.
Great, fantastic. Over to you then, Lucy. I'm going to take myself off the screen there, and I'll hand over to you. So yes, thank you very much.
Okay, let me just make sure I'm pulling up the right thing. Can you see my screen yet?
Yes, I think so. I see. Hold on. Yep, there it is. Perfect.
Okay, lovely stuff.
Can you make it a bit bigger?
Yeah, just popping it on now. So it's being a little bit slow, I think, through the Teams. Sorry. There we go. Can you see that a bit bigger now?
Yes, that's perfect.
Lovely. Okay, so basically, we're going to kind of go through it's basically one of the sessions that I run quite often at the school for people who are maybe not necessarily signing up for a qualification straight away, but want to kind of get a basic idea of why wines come to be in all the different styles that you can find available. So we've already been talking about all these different kinds of wine, from light-bodied dry wines through to very, very heavy, full red wines. I mentioned sherry, for example. And it can be I'm very aware, because I was in this position at one point, very intimidating to not know why the wines come to be in those styles. So you can spend your whole life exploring the different styles. That's one of the exciting things about wine. But I think to just start from scratch and just have a look at all the different things that affect the way that a wine tastes. We're going to do this fairly quickly. So we have, I think, roughly about half an hour here. So I'm just going to focus on one question, which is, what makes one wine different from another? It's a very big question, and there's lots of different things, but I'm going to focus on 4 areas of the winemaking process that are going to influence the way that the wine eventually tastes in your glass. I'm not expecting by the end of this session that you'll be able to kind of walk into a supermarket and go, I know exactly what that wine is going to taste like. But next time you do come to taste a wine, move it around your mouth a little bit, have a little smell of it, have a little taste of it, and just try and remember back to this quite short session and think, all right, I've noticed it's making my mouth water quite a lot. What could that be about? Why was that? So there's 4 major areas that I would say that influence the style of a particular wine. The first one, and in my opinion, probably the most important one, is the grape variety, or the grape varieties that are used in the wine. Because sometimes it's just one type of grape, and sometimes it's a blend of all sorts of different types of grapes. So like with any kind of fruit, with apples, with whatever it might be, there isn't just one type. You've got your Granny Smiths, you've got your Golden Delicious. With grapes as well, you have lots and lots and lots of different types of grapes. And to be honest, there's thousands, and I will never know all of them. And it's not really my ambition to know all of them, but the key ones you might have heard of would be like Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir, Sauvignon Blanc. If you can get your head around what you expect in the glass, if you see one of those on a label, that can be a really great start. So we'll talk a bit about grape varieties in a moment. The next thing after that is, once you've got the grape varieties, you've picked them, as a grape grower, it's where the grapes are going to be grown. So the vineyard environment, is it going to be warm? Is it going to be cold? Is it going to be rainy? Is it going to be cloudy? All that stuff affects the way that the grapes grow, how healthy they are, how ripe they get, etc. And that's going to affect when the grapes are turned into wine. And then we come to winemaking, and there's loads of different decisions that a winemaker could decide to make to influence the style of the wine. And then finally, the last sort of step in the process before the wine is sort of bottled and sold is the maturation stage. So not all wines are aged. Some wines are fermented into wine and then quite soon afterwards bottled and put on the supermarket shelf. But some wines go through a period of what we call maturation, which is another element that can change the way that the wine tastes. So you've got young wines, and then some wines, if they go through an aging process, can gather all these new interesting complex flavors too. So let's start with the grape varieties. One of the first things we do on our level 1 course, and quite a lot of the tastings that I do actually, is we peel a grape. Sounds quite simple, but to actually look at the raw material that you're working with. With beer, there's quite a few different ingredients that go into beer, well, relative to wine. With some other types of alcoholic product as well, there's a kind of mixture of different, a sort of recipe essentially. But with wine, it's quite simple. It comes down to the grape, and if it's not in the grape, it's not going to be in the wine. So every type of grape that's used for winemaking has a few things in common. It has a skin, of course, and it has a pulp. Actually, one of the differences between wine grapes and the grapes that you find in the supermarket, that all grapes used for making wine also have seeds in them. So you don't tend to find those in supermarkets in the UK anymore. They've kind of bred the seeds out, but you'll find seeds. But they're not the most interesting part of the grape. What's really interesting in particular is the skins of the grape. So the skins contain all the colour. So if you were ever to peel a grape, and I challenge you for the next time you are having grapes, and if you were to get some green grapes and some black grapes, and you were to peel the skin off both of them, they'd look the same inside, essentially. So the pulp of the grape is this sort of greeny, translucent colour, very watery, very sweet and sugary, and a bit of acid in there as well, a little bit of going to make your mouth water a touch. But in the skins of the grape, and if you were to just chew on the skin, you'd find that your fingers would be dyed, with the black skins, they'd be dyed red because the pigment, the colour of the grape is all in the skin. and also the tannins. So I don't know how much the people on this call are drinking wine regularly, but if you are a red wine fan, or even someone who's tried red wine at all, you might be familiar with this mouth drying sensation that kind of grips your teeth and your gums. And that's what we call tannin. It's a compound that's found within the skin of the grapes. The reason it's in red wine and not in white wine is that the skins of the grapes are used during red wine making, whereas they're discarded during white wine making. So with white wine making, it's just the juice that's used. With red wine making, you're using the skins. So you're getting that dark color and you're getting the tannins. And the other really interesting thing about the skins is just beneath the surface of the skin, you have lots of little compounds in there that are going to be the flavors of the wine. So the flavors of grapes are very, very different to the flavor of the wine once it's finally made. And a lot of people, when they start tasting wine, especially us kind of self-proclaimed, wine educators and such, we might be talking a lot about, this wine smells like apples and lemons, and this wine smells like black currant and black cherry. And people are kind of going, why doesn't it just smell like grapes though? Because it's made from grapes. Why doesn't it just taste like grapes? Well, it's fermentation. It's the process of the fermentation that takes all these flavors, precursors from the grapes, and it transforms them into the actual aromas that you're going to find in strawberries and black cherries and that kind of thing. And that's why wine is really interesting and also kind of complex, because there's lots and lots of different flavors that you can find. So that's what all grapes have in common. But the things that they have different are the proportions of these. So one grape variety might be very, very thin-skinned. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. I'm going to give you an example of a black grape variety called Pinot Noir. So this might be one that you're familiar with. If you've ever seen a glass of Pinot Noir, it's quite pale in color. And if you move it around your mouth, it doesn't give you a lot of grippy tannins. It's quite soft and quite supple on the palate. It doesn't grip you too much. And that's because it's a very thin-skinned grape. So the thinner the skins are, typically, the lighter the color and the less tannin there is. It's a very refreshing grape. The acidity makes your mouth water, and it has flavors. When it's fermented, the flavors tend to be strawberry and cherry, sort of red fruit flavors. As a complete comparison point, you've got something like Cabernet Sauvignon. So Cabernet Sauvignon is a very, very, very different type of grape, black grape. It's much smaller. It has sort of these thick skins to it, so very thick skins. So the thicker the skin, therefore, the more color in the glass and the more that mouth gripping tannin. And the flavors it gives you are quite different to Pinot Noir. They're black, so we've got black currant here. So it's like, I don't know if you grew up in the UK, Ribena. It's a very, very strong kind of Ribena character. Just kind of any kind of black currant, strong black currant cordial flavor, but also something a bit like mint and a bit like green pepper. And these sound like weird things to have in wine, but the compounds, the flavor compounds that you find in those vegetables like green pepper, you can also find very, very similar ones in Cabernet Sauvignon based wines. So it gets a little bit sciencey in terms of the flavors, but you can see here that two of the most famous red wines, or red wine grapes, black grapes, they're going to give you very, very different wines. They're going to look very different. They're going to taste and smell very different. So the grape variety that's used is one of the most interesting and important things about a wine. And I would say if you were trying to get into the world of wine, or just to know a little bit more about it, whether that's for work or for personal enjoyment, the grape varieties are the place to start. So if you can just learn a few of those major grape varieties and just start to recognize those, that will give you a really, really great head start. Ooh. So yeah, I just got password from that one. I've typo on there. So the vineyard environment that we have here, excuse the typo down there. The environment of the vineyard is going to give you a really, really important insight into how the grapes are going to be grown and how the wines are going to be made. Let's have a little look at this map that I pulled up just for a second there. This is a kind of map that we use to show you roughly where quite a lot of the vineyards in the world, the famous wine regions, are going to be found. They're between 30 and 50 degrees of latitude either side of the equator for the most part. Now, the wine world is always expanding, and there's always a new country that's suddenly selling wine that's interesting to learn about. But in terms of the places that have the kind of natural conditions for growing grapes, they tend to be in these sort of bands of latitude around the equator, so 30 to 50 degrees. Too close to the equator, and you tend to find that the climate becomes very tropical. And what we don't have is these defined seasons. So this kind of sort of spring, summer, autumn, winter. And the vine as a plant just really likes to have those seasons. It's a Mediterranean plant originally, and you find a lot of the grapes being grown around the sort of Mediterranean, sort of south of Spain, into south of Italy, but all across that kind of Mediterranean area. You can find grapes being grown. But of course, you can also find them much further away from the equator towards, well, in the south of England, as I mentioned. So as you can see from this map, the south of England kind of falls just a little bit outside of that 50 degrees of latitude. So typically it was considered to be too cold for grape growing, but with better knowledge of how to grow grapes and with climate change as well. The temperature has been coming up in the UK, and there's been some really great grapes being grown in the UK for quite some time now. But more traditionally, you're finding them in the north of France. So Champagne, the Champagne region in the north of France is very famous, as is Burgundy, and also in France, Bordeaux. There's a lot, France has a lot of those very famous regions. But outside of Europe, we've got the USA, you've got California, you've got Chile, you've got Argentina, you've got New Zealand. And a lot of those countries I just mentioned are obviously going to be a lot warmer than the north of France or the south of England. So this is something that is going to play a big role in how ripe the grapes can get. And actually which grapes can be grown. Some grape varieties only like to be grown in warmer climates. So Cabernet Sauvignon, I was mentioning just now, tends to be grown in sort of moderate to warm climates because it needs a bit of sunshine and a bit more warmth in order to ripen properly. Whereas Pinot Noir can be grown in cooler climates, doesn't need as much sunshine and warmth. The same grape variety grown in different climates will taste different. And it's all about, if we go back to, I wasn't very sciencey at school, but kind of wine got me a bit into science. But if you kind of try and remember back to photosynthesis at school, the more sunlight there is, essentially, sunlight is the power for, what powers photosynthesis. The more sunlight there is, the more the vine is going to ripen, the grapes are going to ripen, and the more sugar you're going to get in the grape. And the sugar is what's going to become the alcohol. Sugar turns into alcohol during fermentation. But also you're going to get different flavors. So let's take an example of the grape variety Chardonnay. So Chardonnay is a grape that you find in the south of England, but you also find it in some of the warmest parts of the world as well. You find it in, for example, the kind of sunniest parts of the Napa Valley. You find it in very sunny parts of Chile, for example. It's happy to be in different climates, but it tastes totally different depending on where you grow it. So if you grow that grape variety in the north of France, it will be very high in acidity. So it will really make your mouth water a lot. And the flavors it gives you tend to be like green apple and green fruits, so pears and that kind of thing, citrus. Whereas if you plant it in a much warmer climate, it tends to get much more sugar, and that ends up with a slightly more alcoholic wine. Maybe a bit less acidity, and also flavors of melon and pineapple and banana. So the whole kind of fruits, sort of white fruit spectrum, essentially, you can find with just one grape variety, but the different environment in the vineyard is what's going to be influencing that. So that is kind of a quick overview of the different things that that can happen, I guess, in the vineyard. So the grape varieties and the environment in which the grape's grown. So the warmer it is, the more sugar there is, for example. We could go into lots of detail about rainy and cloudy and frost and all this kind of stuff as well, but those are the kind of fundamentals of grape growing. So now we kind of, essentially, we can assume that we have a healthy, ripe crop of grapes. The next step in our process is to turn those grapes into wine, and this is the fermentation process. And this is kind of the point of all winemaking, is to turn the sugary liquid that you get out of the center of a grape into alcohol. So this can happen quite naturally. You know, if you just squeeze some grapes and leave the juice out, there is these microorganisms called yeast just all around you. They're all over my hands right now. They're all in my hair. They're all over you. Yeast exist everywhere, but they're particularly abundant in wineries. You know, there's lots and lots of natural yeasts around in wineries. So what happens when yeast comes into contact with a sugary liquid is it starts to eat that sugar, and it turns that sugar into alcohol, which becomes part of the wine, and also the flavors. So that's the fermentation process that changes the flavors of grapes into the flavors of wine, and as we said, dependent on the grape variety that's being used. So this is really, really important time for making not just an alcoholic product, but one that tastes interesting and tastes like the grape variety too. The other byproduct is carbon dioxide gas. So it's just something that's produced by the yeast. For most wines, that just disappears. It kind of bubbles off. But for other wines, it's trapped within the wine. So the wine style I'm talking about there is sparkling wines. So when you're making sparkling wines, you harness that carbon dioxide gas that's been created as a result of the fermentation, and you trap that within the wine, and that's what makes the wine bubbly. But we're going to just focus, I'd love to do another session on sparkling wines and maybe on fortified wines as well, but we'll focus on still light wines for now. And that's basically an overview of what the fermentation process looks like. It differs, though, the way that you make wines, depending on whether you're making white wine, red wine, or rosé wine. I alluded to this a bit earlier on, but let's just focus for now on white wine making. So with white wine making, as I mentioned, you are just using the juice from the grape. So you're using, for the most part, you're using grapes that look a bit like the green grapes that you can get in the supermarket. As you can see here, the top image here, they're a bit more golden, down there a bit more green, depending on how ripe they've got. But you're using grapes that have a greenish, goldenish skin to them, rather than the black-skinned grapes that we've been talking about. However, it is theoretically possible to make a white wine from black grapes, because, as I say, black grapes also just have a clear liquid inside them. So there's not many examples of white wines made from black grapes, but one famous example would be champagne. So with champagne, typically you're going to see a pale yellowy kind of coloured wine, but most of a lot of the grapes that go into that wine are actually black-skinned grapes. They've just had the juice removed and the skins discarded. So with white wine making, what you first do when you take the grapes into the winery is you crush them. It sounds quite aggressive, but actually it's just a gentle squeeze, and that kind of releases some of the liquid. And then you press them quite quickly. So when you press them, it's a bit like pressing a French press of coffee or something. Anything that separates out liquids from solids. So you're separating out the juice from the skins and the seeds and any other sort of solids that might be around in the mix there. And then you've just got this juice, and that's what you ferment into white wine. So typically you're starting with a wine that's going to have quite a light, pale, what we call lemon, but yellowy kind of color to it. You see all sorts of different colors of white wine, but typically the color of the white wine is going to be, if it's going to go more brown or more golden, it's because it's been aging for a period of time. Most white wines are going to start out looking quite sort of lemony in color, a nice sort of vibrant yellow. With red and rosé winemaking, the skins are used, and that's really important. So you can only make red and rosé wine from black-skinned grapes. So with black-skinned grapes, as I mentioned earlier, they not only have color, but they have tannin. So with red winemaking, you're going to be trying to get as much of the color and the tannin out of the skin as you want for the style of wine that you're making. If you want a wine that's really, really deeply colored and that has lots and lots of that grippy tannic structure, which is actually it's really good with food, that tannic structure. It's really good at kind of cutting through fatty meats and things. So if you're wanting something like that, then you're going to mix the skins and the juice together a lot during the fermentation. So there's this whole mess of skins and juice together that ferments during the red wine making process. And a bit like making a cup of tea, the more you agitate it, the sort of longer it's left in contact with the hot water, the deeper the color of the beverage becomes. And also with tea also has tannins. So if if you're a tea drinker, that kind of grippy sensation that you get on the palate with an overbrewed cup of tea is essentially it's the same compound as you find with red wine. So you've got that nice mixture of stuff there going on with the red wine. And it's only right at the end of the fermentation process that you take the liquid away from the solid mass of skins. So then you'll have a deeply coloured wine. You'll have, certainly a much more deeply coloured wine than you would have with white wine. And that's obviously going to be quite different to what you have with rosé wines. So when you have rosé wines, this has been a very popular few months for rosé. There's been a lot of rosé being, I think, bought to, once pubs were reopened, but also to drink at home. Rosé wines can range from very, very lightly coloured, just a tiny little bit of pink, through to something that looks almost quite close to a red wine. And rosé wines are made, again, by contact with the skins, but just for a much shorter period of time. So you could just do a few hours on the skins, and that would just give you a little bit of color, or you could have it a little bit longer just to kind of get the color a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. But what you don't tend to find with rosé wines is you don't tend to find tannins in there. They don't tend to keep the skins in contact with the liquid long enough for the tannin to take over or to give you much sense of that at all. So they're much more about sort of being refreshing and fruity. So that's the kind of basics of red versus rosé versus white wine making. But during this process also, there's lots and lots of different types of winemaking practices. You know, you can go completely organic and natural and not put any kinds of one option that you can do is buy in yeasts, buy in a strain of yeast that lets the wine do a certain specific thing, or you can just let your vat of wine be influenced by the local indigenous yeast. And if you hear people talking about natural wines, that's going to be for the most part the way that they're made with the local yeast rather than anything that's been bought in. So there's lots of different ideas and lots of different practices around winemaking that can influence the way that the wine eventually tastes too. The last thing of those four that I'm just going to talk about a little bit, because it's the last stage really in defining a wine's style, is maturation. So the wine, whether you allow the wine to get older or not. Some wines benefit from getting older. So some wines, are designed really to be aged for a period of time once they're made. So, quite a lot of premium quality red wines, certainly ones made from Cabernet Sauvignon, for example, which is a really popular grape variety in Bordeaux. They will be aged, and even in some regions by law, they have to be aged for a period of time. And the idea there is that they'll change their character a bit. So with Cabernet Sauvignon, it starts off very, very tannic, very grippy. But a bit of aging in a barrel tends to soften out the texture and make it taste a little bit smoother, a little bit softer. But also one of the major reasons for aging a wine, particularly in a barrel, is to change its flavors. So a barrel-aged wine, especially if it's been put into a barrel that's been recently made, so recently what they call coopered, is going to take on the flavors of the barrel. And they're not necessarily the flavors, they're not like the flavors if you were to go and chew on an oak twig. They're quite different flavors. They're the flavors that are made when you're creating an oak barrel. So when they make the barrels to get these staves of wood, and they have to heat them up and make them pliable enough to kind of bend into the shape of the barrel. And to heat them up, they char them over a big flame. So they're essentially toasting the oak like you would toast a piece of bread. And you know how bread tastes different from toasted bread. It just has different flavors to it. So those flavors can be spicy, like they can be almost like cinnamon or cloves, or just sometimes like smokiness. And sometimes it does taste like toasted bread, but lots of different types of aromas can be created from that barrel making process. So obviously when you put a wine into that barrel, it just absorbs that flavor into the wine. So when you do hear someone talking about a wine being quite spicy or quite smoky or toasty, it's usually a very good indication that it's spent some time aging in oak. And that might be a white wine, it could be a red wine, lots of different styles of wine are aged in oak. But also equally a lot of them aren't. And there's very good reasons for not aging wines or not aging them at all. Some wines just don't necessarily have flavors that benefit from aging. Some wines are meant to be young and fruity and fresh, and that's how people like them. That's how people enjoy them. So Sauvignon Blanc is a great variety that you very, very rarely find is going to be aged, because it's at its best when it's young and fresh and tastes really, really fruity and really floral. Whereas other grape varieties lend themselves a little bit better to barrel age. But you can also age the wine in a bottle too. This is a good one to note, because one of the biggest challenges in hospitality when you're working with wines is knowing how to store them, but also whether to store them and how quickly certain wines need to be drunk. Because some wines have a fairly small window, particularly if the restaurant is quite warm, it doesn't have necessarily a cellar to it. So some wines really suit being drunk as young and fresh as possible. Whereas others actually benefit from like a really nice long period of time just chilling out in a cool cellar somewhere. On its, as you see these bottles here on their end, so that the cork doesn't dry out if it has a cork. Some wines really benefit from that. Some wines can last for decades in the bottle, but most wines, the vast majority of wines, are going to be at their best probably within about a year after they are sort of taken to market. So some wines will have flavors of maturation, others won't. Some wines will just taste very similar to how they did once the fermentation ended. And you can see these big stainless steel tanks here. These are just being used for storage purposes. They are basically just a holding area for the wine before it's put into a bottle. So some wines don't go through any maturation at all. I hope that all makes sense. I'm very happy to take any questions on any of this. I think I've seen a few popping up. But just to kind of, I guess, round off, just a picture here of some of the different styles that you can find. And if you ever get the opportunity to taste a couple of wines, maybe even more than a couple of wines next to one another, that is when I first did that. I think it was a quiet day in a pub, and my boss let me have a taste of a few of the different wines that we were selling next to each other. And you just start to notice these little differences that you don't always notice when you only have one wine in front of you. And this is where the kind of whole world of wine comes alive a little bit. And if you can kind of go, oh, that wine's more, it makes my mouth water more than that wine. You can go, oh, well, that's the acidity. So that means probably it was made with a grape variety that had a lot of acidity, or maybe it was grown in a cooler climate, because cooler climates give grapes with higher levels of acidity. So there's so much more to explore. That's a very, very basic overview of how wine is made and how it comes to be in various different styles. But I hope that was at least a little bit useful. And if you do fancy learning more, there's tons of free online educational content on WSET's YouTube channel. Happy to take some questions as well.
Right, Ed, what have you got in the chat then? Any thoughts? Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting, and hopefully has inspired some of our guys here to delve a little bit deeper into the world of wine. But I'm sure there's some questions already in the chat there, Ted.
There are a few questions in the chat. I've got a few of my own. I'll do the gangs first. I'll save mine. So Martin's asking, and Beth's asking a sort of question that's reasonably similar. So Martin's asking, is global warming likely to alter the growing areas? And Beth's adding to that, could greenhouse gases be used to recreate the specific ideal climate for growing wine?
Oh, that's a very good question. So the first part of that, absolutely. And there is an awful lot of research going on at the moment into how some of the places around the world that are already quite warm are going to deal with temperatures getting warmer and warmer, because they're starting to panic about, the sugar levels are going up in some of the grapes. Mm-hmm. And not everybody loves a very, very alcoholic wine. So how do they keep the alcohol levels in check, when the sugar's going up? A nice long growing season is what a lot of grape producers are after, because that gives lots of flavor complexity. So yes, it is changing the wine world for sure. It's one of the reasons why the UK is becoming quite well known for its wines now. It didn't used to be, but equally it poses a challenge for producers at the warmer end of the spectrum. The good thing is there's lots and lots of grape varieties that we don't know that much about yet. That are quite local to some of the warmer places. We just haven't really explored them. So there's some warmer climate, grape varieties that are happy in warmer climates that are being tested out at the moment, because I think that's the way of things at the moment. We're going to need some of those grapes that are happier in warmer places. And sorry, the second part of the question was?
The second bit was, could you use greenhouse gases to recreate that specific ideal climate? So I suppose polytunneling would be the natural step.
Yes, and it has been. Yes, so it has been done. To be honest, I'm not 100%. I'm not very up on the legality of sort of greenhouses and wine in different parts of the world. So I won't. But yes, I mean, in theory, there have been experiments going on with sort of mocked up environments for sure.
Brilliant. There's a really interesting question that we had, which I've written a bit of a longer answer to. So Athman was asking, what substance is it in wine that makes it harder to breathe when you drink it? And Martin was noting that Matt was noting that he's got asthma and definitely notices breathing becomes more laboured the day after drinking wine. So I did mention sulfur dioxide, which is one of the 14 major allergens, and perhaps mild anaphylactic shock causing a swelling of the windpipe, but then that's also in red meat, pickled food and all that kind of stuff. So if it's only happening with wine, is there anything you know of that would do that?
Yeah, I mean, that would have been my answer too, exactly, pretty much word for word. It's interesting. I think sometimes, because obviously it's in meat, it's in packaged fruits, so in wine it's in actually fairly a fairly low proportion in comparison to some of those other products. But there is also the fact that you are drinking it over a period of time, and that may be contributing to some people's asthma. Yeah, so it is obviously a mild allergen, and some producers use it very, very sparingly. Some producers, in fact, don't use sulfur dioxide at all. It's very, very, very difficult though to make a wine without any at all. It basically is a protective, it protects wine from bacteria and from oxygen. It's very difficult to make a long-lasting wine without it. But producers have certainly been bringing their levels down because people are becoming more sensitive to it. Not only just to the effects of it, but also sometimes the aroma of it can be. In some of the big brand wines, it used to be the case that you could stick your nose in and you could smell the sulfur, which is what you want.
It's I must admit it's something I still sniff for and find occasionally, and then tend to avoid, because I know that I found that the wines that are higher in sulfur dioxide tend to give me more of a hangover just because of the chemical impurity. But it's definitely something I find less now and now. Gang, if anyone isn't experiencing the oddness of breathing after drinking wine, it might be worth asking your doctor for an allergens test, where they scratch your wrist with a little thing and it tells you whether you're allergic to stuff, but it's something you can bring up with them. Have you tried, Athman's also asking, have you tried a wine called Mascara? Spelt like mascara.
Spelt like mascara? No, well, not to my knowledge. There's a possibility I have, but I'm afraid I don't recall it just off the top of my head. Is it one that we'd recommend?
She's saying it's a good wine.
Good wine? Excellent. Well, I'll have a look out for it. It's my favourite part of teaching, is getting recommendations for wines. I'm
with you, boss. I'm with you. Matt's asking, what sort of affordable price range would you be looking at for a good bottle of wine? So I'm going to preface that by saying that everyone's affordable price range is going to vary. But Lucy, if you give us yours, that would be great.
It's a really good question. I mean, I buy wines at all prices, and obviously you can get some great bargains when you go overseas as well and buy actually at the source. But obviously in the UK, to my mind, based on my own personal preferences, that you start to be able to taste interesting stuff in wines somewhere between the kind of £8 and the £12 mark. It's actually becoming harder and harder to find wines that are below that now. I think they've sort of seemed to have jumped up quite a lot recently. It used to be that you could find some wines a little bit below that. But in terms of, I mean, I buy plenty of wine that's a little bit less than that, just the sort of day-to-day drinking. But in terms of good bottle of wine that I'm just kind of, you open it and you go, oh, you know what, I really like that. They tend to be more around that £10 mark for me, personally.
I think I'm with you 100% on that one. Have you tried the wines from the 19 Crimes producer, the American company?
Yes. Yeah. They've been doing really well. It's really exciting stuff.
They're brilliant. Gang, it's a recommend from me that if you're looking to try a red wine, and maybe it's not something that you've enjoyed before, the 19 Crimes red wine that you can buy in Tesco and most good supermarkets is very, very yummy and quite drinkable.
Yeah.
We've got another question from Athman. Is a French wine brought from North Africa?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure I understand.
Athman, you're gonna have to elaborate on that one. In the meantime, I've got a question. When it comes to aging bottles of wine, so I'm a little bit of a wine nerd. I love collecting. When it comes to aging a bottle of wine, what's the best way to tell if a wine is going to be one that is good to lay down on its side and turn every once in a while?
It's very difficult to tell without tasting it, unless you're able to do a bit of research online. So there are some good websites online. So you've got something called Cellar Tracker, which is quite a useful one, where other people have tested it for you, and they say, actually, I think it could do with a bit more time. So it's quite a good tool. But in terms of just kind of the things that a wine needs in order to age well, it needs to be of a certain quality. It needs to be a wine that has a lot of flavour, a lot of intensity to it. It also tends to be a wine that has something in it that is going to preserve it as well. So natural preservatives, I'm not talking about sulfur dioxide here, I'm talking about natural preservatives like tannins. So that tannin stuff that I was talking about earlier actually really helps to keep a wine fresh for longer. So the higher the level of tannin, quite often the longer the wine is able to last. As long as it also has lots of character and flavour to it. But also with white wines, acidity can be really helpful for that. So we know that acidity is quite good at kind of keeping lots of things out of substances of wine and see anything that's pickled as well. But acidity, even in the relatively low proportions of wine, can be quite a good way of preserving wine over the long term too. But the biggest thing really is it needs to be of a good enough flavour concentration and have flavours that are going to develop in a nice way for it to benefit from aging. There are some tricks just to learn. So there's a few grape varieties just to avoid aging. One I mentioned earlier is Sauvignon Blanc. Lovely, lovely when fresh. But even the most, this is, I guess, maybe my opinion, but even the most outstanding bottles of Sauvignon Blanc, even the most flavorful ones, don't actually get better as they get older. They just kind of, they start off tasting all like grassy and like floral, and they end up tasting a bit like cabbage and not particularly tasty. But in terms of knowing whether a wine is going to age or not, it's a really complex question. I don't think I've given you a very good answer to that.
Actually, I thought that was pretty perfect, boss. I'm with you on Sauvignon. I've never aged a Sauvignon before because the oldest one I ever tried was really rank. But otherwise, I'm with you 100%. Athman, she wasn't asking us a question. She was giving us an answer to what we are. So Mascara is a French wine that is brought from North Africa.
Oh, cool.
So it sounds like a nice blend.
Right.
Hajit saying in the chat, every wine I've ever tried I've never really enjoyed. I'm not a huge drinker, but I enjoy alcohol drinks that have a sweet, fruity flavor that almost takes away the alcohol taste. Is there a wine in mind that you could recommend to try?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. So a really good one that a lot of people who've said the same thing to me have decided that they quite like is there's an Italian style of wine called Moscato d'Asti. You can find it in other parts of the world as well. The grape variety is Moscato, but Asti is a part of, it is in Italy, in Piemonte, and they're famous for making quite low alcohol wines, and they're sparkling, they're fizzy, and they are quite sweet as well. So you find that they are a really kind of good, they're kind of the slightly alcoholic grape juice, essentially, is what they're like. So they're really fruity and very much sort of close to being that slightly sweeter, sweeter grape juicy kind of thing, but they have a little bit more complexity to them. They're kind of essentially half fermented wines. So that's a really good place to start. But also I would go for maybe some of the slightly sweeter wines from a grape variety called Riesling as well. So Riesling is a really interesting grape that can be made completely really, really, really sweet, or it can be made really, really, really dry, and it can be everything in between. Can be a bit tricky to know, but if you ever see that grape variety and there's someone around to ask, Riesling, thanks for putting in the chat there. If you ask maybe the nearest person, whether it's someone in a bar or in a shop, whether it's going to be a dry or a sweet style, they should be able to give you an idea on that one. The slightly sweeter ones are really good for people who aren't necessarily that into wine, but they just want something a little bit, want something to try.
Nice, absolutely brilliant. I'm actually just linking in. I've linked in a bottle of Prosecco d'Asti from Moscato d'Asti from Tesco. I've also linked in a Riesling there that I happen to know is a sweeter one because I've drunk it before.
Nice, thank you for that. That's great.
Rock and roll. I don't see any more questions in the chat. Athman saying we're speaking about wine like we're missing it. I'm missing wine because I'm not drinking it right now. I don't have any more questions in the chat. Wolfgang, what have you got going on, boss?
No, I'm okay actually. I'm looking forward to a wine for tonight. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to have, but I always like a wine with my meal, and even just one or two glasses there. It certainly enhances any meal, I would say. So yeah, I'm looking forward to my wine tonight. What's on your menu tonight then, Lucy? What are you going to have tonight with your dinner? Any suggestions?
I'm quite excited actually. We're doing I've got a stock on in the background. We're doing a paella tonight, so looking forward to that very much. It's a proper country paella, and I think we'll be going for a rioja to go along with it. A white rioja, so a white wine from. Yeah, white wine from the region of Rioja in Spain. That's one of my other favourite wines.
Fantastic! That sounds delicious. I'm slightly jealous here. Yeah, no. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm sure you will. Is there anything else from the guys? Guys, this is maybe an opportunity also to unmute if for any of those who have not got the chat function available there. This is the moment to ask any questions there. Otherwise, Ted, anything else?
We had the classic one about feet. Yes, the traditional way of making wine is with your feet, but with modern production quantities needed, we tend to use machinery these days.
Yeah,
Beth in the chat is saying, is there a place where we learn about the barrels for maturing?
That's a very good question. Do I have a place that's specifically talking about that? Do you know, it's given me a very good idea to do for us to do a webinar on it. At the school, we do sort of every other week we do a free webinar, and we haven't yet done one that's specifically talking about barrel maturation or like about the barrel. So maybe that's something that we'll put on our agenda for the next month or so.
I would attend that session. I would read that. I would read that article. It's a great question. I'd nerd out over that really hard.
Fantastic. Right, guys, if that is us, then just leaves us again to say thank you so much, Lucy, for joining us today. It's been very informative. I hope, and I'm sure we will, or you have encouraged some of the folks out there to maybe just investigate wines a little bit more. Maybe some people who are always thought of themselves of not liking wine, that they're maybe just a bit more courageous now to go into the supermarket and just buy a bottle and just have a go at it. It is a wonderful world of wine out there, and I can thoroughly recommend to drink responsibly, of course, but to just investigate a little bit. It's a very exciting subject, and especially when you combine it with food, that can be really quite an exciting combination. So thank you so much, Lucy, for this wonderful presentation, and enjoy your paella and your white Rioja tonight. Yes, I'm sure it'll be wonderful. I'm slightly jealous here.
Enjoy your meal as well.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, Lucy.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Add my thanks in and end the recording just there. Lucy, if you want to stay on for a moment, that would be great. There goes the recording. Dun, dun, dun.